Okay, my name is Scott, if everybody's ready. First of all, I'd just like to thank you all for coming to this workshop. My name's Tim Aldridge, I'm chairing the session today. I work for Nature Picture Library, which is a photo agency based here in Bristol, and we specialise in images from the natural world. And I'm delighted to have the opportunity today to talk about the language of imagery. We're going to be hearing from 3 different speakers, and then we'll go out to some questions and more open discussion. But first of all, I just want to ask the question, why go visual? Well, I guess the main reason is that we live in a visual world where people are increasingly communicating with pictures instead of words. Between Facebook and Instagram alone, we're seeing consumers generating nearly 2.5 billion images every week. Now that's just 2 websites. So the world is literally flooded with images. Using photography, we can communicate across borders of language, culture, and time. And importantly, we need to use images to keep up with the competition. So as conservation communicators, we are competing for space in the mainstream consciousness. And we need to be using the same kinds of tools that have made advertising and corporate media messaging so contagious. And one of those tools is certainly creative photography. Using text by itself is no longer enough to get people's attention, and it's less likely to change people's perceptions and ultimately their behaviour patterns. So, a scientific study in conservation biology found that promoting conservation through the arts may reach a more diverse audience and reach them more successfully by engaging their hearts as well as their minds. And what this is telling us, or one of the things this is telling us, is that photography and images speak a different language, a more emotional language, and one that recognises how people feel about the natural world. So by using photographs, you're suddenly communicating on a much more personal level with people. One of the main reasons that we use photographs is to get people's attention, and there are numerous examples of this working. A PhD study in 2005 found that NHS patients were more likely to read handouts if they had pictures in them. And a recent eye tracking study found that participants spent more time looking at photographs on Facebook than they did looking at text. Is that the same for you guys in this room? Did anybody spend more time looking at text on the slide than they did? So these are some extreme examples of attention-grabbing images. Adverts published by people for the ethical treatment of animals. And PETA have learned through experience that animal suffering alone isn't enough to get the media's attention. They need eye-provoking visuals, and these controversial images are what actually got them the media attention and free advertisements. And that ultimately led people to their website, led people to their undercover videos. Which is then the catalyst for the real change. PETA have been a very successful organisation. They've been instrumental in convincing hundreds of cosmetics companies to abandon animal testing. And they've also managed to convince McDonald's and Burger King and the like to improve animal welfare in their chain. But we don't just want to get people's attention, we also want to use images to change their behaviour. And this is an example of that from outside of the conservation sphere. When the Marlboro Man was introduced in 1955, sales skyrocketed more than 3,000% in less than a year, and repositioned the product from what was considered a mild as May ladies' cigarette to a product with a much broader appeal. On the flip side of that, the introduction of pictorial warnings on smoking cigarette packets has proven has shown that it's more likely for people to actually increase their motivation to quit smoking. Getting back to the world of conservation now, I suppose most of you will have heard of Ansel Adams. He was a photographer whose images of the Sierra Nevada mountains were instrumental in convincing Congress in 1940 to designate Kings Canyon National Park. He wasn't the first person to do this. Carlton Watkins and Henry William Jackson did the same for Yosemite and Yellowstone National Park in the 1800s. And elsewhere in the world, people like Peter Dombrowski's and Shisha Nong have been credited with leading environmental movements in Australia and China respectively with their photographs. This is a specific example of a project by photographer Carl Amann, which culminated in the publication of his book Consuming Nature in 2004. His book and his work brought the issue of bushmeat hunting to the international agenda and gained attention all over the world. There's a quote in the corner here by the French president at the time, Jacques Chirac, who said, "The information I gathered from this book provoked great dismay. It constitutes one of the directions of the policy of France that I keep maintaining as heads of state." This is the last example that I want to talk about. This is biologist Michael Fay, who spent 2 years trekking through the remote heart of Africa, from the Congo to the Atlantic coast of Gabon. And he was accompanied for several months by photographer Nick Nichols. And when Fay showed these images to the president of Gabon, he decided to create a network of 13 national parks. So photography is successful in getting people's attention, and it can also change behaviour. Perhaps one of the reasons for this was given to us by environmental photographer Robert Ketchum, who said, "Today, an artist's perspective of the natural world has greater value than ever before, because man has removed himself so far from nature that an artist's work is often the only thing that keeps the observer in contact with it." So we will be getting an artist's perspective later on, but first of all, I'd like to introduce Joanna Heed, who is a communications and photography consultant for Survival International. She's been a voice for tribal peoples, wildlife and conservation issues, and she's written for many magazines and newspapers, as well as authored several major photographic books. And Joanna's going to talk to us a little bit about the power of photography in communications. Over to you.
Hello. I just wanted to start by saying that in 1969 there was a very large photographic feature that was published in the Sunday Times magazine, written by the well-known journalist Norman Lewis, with photographs by the equally well-known photojournalist Don McCullum. It was about the previously unknown and unexposed genocide of Brazilian Indians at the time. And the publication of these shocking images, along with the text, created such a furore that it led to the foundation of Survival International, where I now work. So Survival's been campaigning for 40 years for tribal rights, to secure their land rights and their futures and their ways of life. And to a large extent they have concentrated in exposing the tragedies that surround tribal peoples, the mining, the logging, the dispossession of land, the cultural disintegration, the chronic diseases. Excuse me. A few years ago, I suggested that it might be a good idea to also expose, largely through their huge photographic archive, the good stories, the good news stories, if you like, the more awe-inspiring, wondrous stories about how the tribal peoples live from the Amazon to the Arctic, the really interesting human stories. After all, these are people who still live in harmony with their environments, very close to their lands, who measure time by the cycles of the moon, who can gauge the type of Arctic ice by looking at patterns in the clouds, or who use the song of an African bird to guide them to bees' nests in ancient baobab trees in order to extract honey. These are obviously very colourful human stories and lend themselves very well to being photographed, and thus through the combination of aesthetics and information inherent in the photograph of the story, it can be very valuable by Survival using it in engaging new audiences and stirring imaginations. They can connect viscerally to a photograph in an instant. People are moved to save and protect what they love. So beautiful images can trigger empathy and help people to realise at the very beginning of the journey to action, if you like, why they should care about and campaign for the tribal peoples. This was essentially this was the philosophy for my book We Are One, photographic anthology I did for Survival, and it then led on to being the foundation for the daily communications philosophy in terms of telling the human stories. This now translates on a daily basis to photo features, production of photo features, photo galleries, quote pictures, which I will talk about more later on. and various different photographic projects that we produce in collaboration with many different photographers around the world, which are published on our website and then syndicated to different newspapers, magazines, and online outlets. The strength of the images that are used in these projects succeed, and we can see this through analytics and bringing people to our website and signing up to our campaigns and donating. This image, for example, is a picture of a Brazilian tribe, an uncontacted, in fact, Brazilian tribe, one of only 100 uncontacted tribes that are left in the world. They are at the headwaters of something called the Envira River, deep in the Brazilian Amazon. This was an overflight with a very long lens. And I used it in conjunction with an article I wrote for National Geographic about uncontacted peoples. And this image received 10,000 Facebook likes very quickly. And I very much doubt that had the article not been illustrated with it, it would have received anything like the same attention. And just in the next couple of photographs, I'm just going to show you some very striking images that have drawn people to our website. This is a group of Maasai warriors racing along a river in Kenya. This is a picture of Moken children, Moken are semi-nomadic, what are called sea gypsies from the Negri archipelago in the Andean Sea, who spend most of the year hunting and harpooning fish under the water. They have extraordinary eyesight. As the nature photographer Boyd Norton says, sometimes you also have to shock people. This is a photograph of Guarani children who hang themselves. The Guarani were a tribe that were one of the first tribes to be contacted after the conquistadors arrived in South America, and they had a huge amount of land, most of which they have now lost. This loss of land has been the root cause of their suffering. Many have committed suicide, and in fact, this year we have discovered that more than 625 Guarani killed themselves, the majority of the victims being between 15 and 29. The youngest was 9. This sums up all those facts brutally well. This is another image. The Eastern Paraguayan Indians, taken again by photographer Don McCullen. So these images trigger different emotions to the first 3. I just thought I'd briefly outline the way in which we use images on a daily basis at Survival. This is the front page of our website. Great big hero image, and then an image that shows where you can go to different galleries that are produced. These images are changed on a regular basis. This is an example of a photographic feature that I produce a lot of these in collaboration with different photographers. These pictures were by well-known photographers, Carol Beckford and Angela Fisher, who had long taken photographs of tribal peoples, particularly in Africa. When I work with different photographers who have pictures of tribal peoples, I make a point of saying very much from the outset that we have no funding, no budget for photographs, and that should they wish to us to use their images, that they won't be financially compensated. But I think it's very important to make the point at that time that what we can offer in terms of a quid pro quo arrangement is they gain a huge amount of exposure from their photographs being published on our website, and then also if it is published again in a newspaper or magazine, and we often have features translated into different languages and published in Europe as well as in the States, that their credit and their website details, should they wish them to be published, are very clearly displayed. And I think this is, I know it's something else you'll come on to, but I think it's incredibly important in a matter of not only professional courtesy, but photographers have to make a livelihood, and if they're kind enough to contribute their images, then it's always good to know that you're making sure their credit is accurate. Another example of this in fact was a slightly quirky angle on the Olympics. I put together a series of images showing the innate athletic skills of different tribes, which actually brought together several different photographers. So there can be a bit of negotiating involved in that contractually, which is then published on The Guardian. And similarly, this is about the Sami reindeer migration, which happens every autumn in northern Norway. The Sami push their reindeer down to the bottom of the loch. They then swim across. The whole swim takes a week for the entire herd to cross over to the winter pastures. What is very effective in doing a photo story such as this is that you can instantly gain people's attention through strong images and an interesting and quirky story, and then smuggle in some of the more less appetizing or not quite as immediately interesting messages, but that are very important to campaigning on the back of it. So it's like a front door, and then you can smuggle in messages behind it in the back door. This is what I was talking about earlier, a quote picture, which is where you carefully choose a strong image and dramatic or poetic words and make sure they resonate well together. These have huge impact on Facebook. Very quickly, people are liking them, sharing them, spreading them. And they're really fairly simple to do in Photoshop. Now, I just thought I would take you through a few of the images that we have collected from different photographers, journalists in the last few years. This is of the Sartan people of northern Mongolia driving their reindeer to the winter camps. This again is the Gwari people I talked about earlier, who are camping on the side of roads, taken by photographer Simon Rawls. I think it's incredibly evocative and seeing just what destitute people they have become. The Amazon burning, Daniel Beltra. Other end of the spectrum, a joyous one with Gwari children. The Yanomami shaman, deep in the Amazon. Bushman of the Central Kalahari Game Reserve in Botswana, taken by American photographer Brent Sturgeon. Migration of caribou, Gwich'in caribou in Alaska. Baaka pygmies in the DRC, surrounding this tiny bit of forest, is their land is completely denuded by illegal logging and fat bushmeat poaching. This shows the annual migration of the Nenets people in northern Siberia. They move from the southern part of the Yamal Peninsula up to the north. It takes them 1,000. It is 1,000 kilometers long, their migration. Excuse me. This is a Panan child in the Sarawak rainforest in Borneo. There are about 10 to 12,000 Panan. All in the 1950s were nomadic hunter-gatherers. Only a couple of hundred remain. Most of them have been settled, having been evicted from the rainforest. Actually, there are a couple of dams being built at the moment, which means the remaining will probably be evicted as well. This is a sort of contrast in terms of photographs. This is also a Panan man, and this is a part of rainforest that has been deforested. Again, this is extraordinarily long limbs. This is an uncontacted tribe called the Mashco Piro on the edge of the Manu National Park in southeastern Peru. There are very few photographs of uncontacted peoples. Shanuka tribe from Peru and Brazil. Yanomami father with his son. This is the Innu people from northeastern Canada who in the last 50 years have gone from being semi-nomadic hunter-gatherers roaming around a huge, vast area of territory to being settled, largely depressed, unemployed, with high rates of diabetes and suicide. And a joyous one to end Aboriginal children in the desert in Australia.
Thank you very much, Joanna. Our next speaker is Nick Upton. Nick has been making films and taking photographs for 25 years and has won awards for both. And he's going to talk to us a little bit about his work with conservation organisations and give us the artist's perspective.
Thank you, Tim. As Tim says, I've been making wildlife films and taking stills for, well, I did say, for some 25 years. Thinking back, since Joanna mentioned Don McCullin, it's actually more like 40 years. Don McCullin actually used to be my neighbour, name dropping, whatever, but my earliest photos was actually with old film stock that was out of date that he would give to me and my brother, and he used to lend us the odd lens as well. So without realising it, I was always a huge fan of Don, I do a completely different kind of photography, but that mission to kind of tell a story through images, maybe he helped seed that. So yeah, I think one can think back to what inspired one, but I think Don was certainly part of it for me. Anyway, while directing and producing films, I've always sought to get good photos to help promote the films, and in the last years my stills photography has been actually taking over more and more with a linkage to a film. I actually finished my last film over a year ago, but I really like stills photography. I don't have to sell an idea to a jaded TV commissioner. I get more jaded all the time from where I sit. If I'm interested in a story, I just get out there and start taking photos, and rewards of all kinds often follow. Increasingly, I'm working with conservation organisations, and I tend to offer low-resolution images for free use on their websites and for publicity, with a credit, ideally, in return for access and cooperation that they offer. Once I've got the shots, I look to sell them through agencies like Nature Picture Library and to magazines directly, and if possible to get further commissioned backing to keep the work going on the project I've started. I really enjoy doing this kind of work. I know my shots have been useful to the projects, and this collaborative approach has actually started to work out for me too in terms of image sales and commissions, and it's a model I fully intend to keep pursuing. I'll mostly talk about my work with the about cranes in Europe and their reintroduction to Somerset after a 400-year gap. But I'll also talk on some other conservation projects I've collaborated with. I first photographed cranes when I began to help the RSPB film unit produce a film about cranes across Europe. We started some 5 years ago, and I accepted a lower daily rate than I usually did as a director, partly as the RSPB agreed that I could take stills wherever we were in the field, and that I could keep copyright on them. And I gave the RSPB copies for their own use, which is fine by me, as long as I get a credit, which the RSPB, to be fair, they're very good, they always do. And I went on to make 2 further films for the RSPB about the UK crane reintroduction to complement the European film. Anyway, along the way with the RSPB, I got to photograph cranes migrating in huge flocks across Germany, flying from big roosts at dawn, special access to a lovely reserve in Germany. I got shots showing the potential dangers of wind turbines to cranes, and the very real dangers of power cables. Cables kill more cranes than anything else across Europe. I photographed huge numbers of cranes massing near the Pyrenees. It's a wonderful experience, and flying over them. To wait a long time for those kind of shots. And when the Great Crane Project got underway, I photographed the project team collecting eggs from wild nests in Germany. I was actually there allegedly directing, interviewing and doing sound, wearing waders deep in the marsh, but also with my stills camera around my neck, so grabbing the odd shot between video takes. So who says men can't multitask? As the project unfolded, I gave copies of my shots to the project partners who I worked with, the RSPB and the Wildfound Wetlands Trust, and to the Great Crane Project itself. And during that project, I got to photograph crane chicks, very cute, being reared at WWT Slimbridge. The young birds being led out onto the Somerset levels following their foster parents, dressed as cranes. This was actually the 3rd batch of cranes, releases happening over 5 years. And I took this photograph long after we'd actually finished making the film, because by then I'd become so obsessed with cranes, as people do, spend time on cranes, and then the crane I started to photograph them a lot in my own time, but I continued to give copies of my photos to the organisations that helped me. And after 3 years, and probably 4 years of working with the team, they really trusted me by that stage. So I was allowed to become sort of fully embedded in the flock, if you like. I took these shots by wearing the same costume as the foster parents. So the birds were treating me like another crane, which is great in some ways, apart from them pecking at me, and it was very hard to see through the focus through the mast. And it's a good thing I had autofocus on my camera set that day. I photographed the release birds coping with the coldest winter for 100 years, very well actually, being monitored by very tough volunteers. It was -7 all day that day. I photographed the birds growing up and loudly claiming ownership of the Somerset levels, which hasn't happened for 400 years. And this year I photographed birds building a nest, the first of the released birds. This was actually on the marshes around Slimbridge, where some of the cranes had flown back to. And this pair actually hatched a chick this year. It didn't survive, but they're really babies, they're only 3 years old. But it's a really good sign for the future. I'm pretty sure they'll breed next year successfully. So, I've gathered a big portfolio of images that tell a story about the cranes and their reintroduction. But how does that help the project and its backers, and has it helped me personally? Well, I started doing it in my own time, not knowing if they'd ever be used. But actually, it's worked out really well all round, I think. My images have been used in RSPB's Birds magazine about the making of the European film. They've used it to promote screenings of the crane films in village halls around the country, big time, but important groundwork for the RSPB. They use my shot to promote sales of the DVD. And the distributor is using my shots to help promote the film when it's selling it to broadcasters. It's actually sold quite well around Europe. My crane shots are often used on the RSPB's website. Credit there somewhere. And in information leaflets. This is in an information leaflet, actually designed for farmers, trying to encourage them why cranes would be a good idea on their land. And also by the RSPB's partner, BirdLife International. That's my shot being used in a campaign about protecting migrating birds. The Wildfowl and Weapons Trust has also used a number of my images on their website. And they used one of mine on the cover of their annual report. Down to money, Viridor Credits, who's the company that bankrolled the Great Crane Project and helped fund the film, they use my shots too. This is the lead page about the project on their website. And the Great Crane Project itself uses my images extensively in talks, sort of outreach talks around Somerset, and on their website to explain the project to anybody who's interested and to report on its progress. And they've used shots that cover early days of chick rearing through to the birds being released on the levels, how they survived the first winter, and this creates some interest, how the first pairs began to form up. My shots have also been used in the project's newsletter, and maybe more importantly, on a wider scale, is in getting media attention through press releases sent out by the project and by Nature Picture Library, along with my shots. And a number of online magazines and news sites have used my images thanks to those releases. From Birdwatch magazine, a number of BBC news sites have used the shots and covered the project. This is a recent feature on Radio 4's website. Martin Hughes Games was tweeting about the common crane. No credit there actually. And on The Guardian online. At the same time as these mostly free uses, my crane images have benefited me directly in various ways. I contributed photos and a chapter to a book on cranes in Norfolk, which has sold much better than we expected. It was kind of privately published. I just did the work to help the guys out and help me, but it's actually sold quite well, and I keep getting checks for it, which is very nice. I was accepted to work as a guest photographer on a big multimedia conservation project, 2020 Vision, which Tim's going to tell you about later, to supply photos of the crane reintroduction project, but also other wildfowl in Somerset. I also did a contract on urban and garden bugs. I do at least half the work I do is macro. A number of my shots ended up in the book of the 2020 Vision project. And they're now part of a 3-year touring audiovisual roadshow an outdoor exhibition. I think it's coming to Bristol sometime next year. And my 2020 vision link led to further exposure for my work and the project. This is on the CBBC Newsround website, which featured 10 shots about sort of worthy projects around the UK, and they used one of the my shot of the Great Crane Project. A Nature Picture Library has also been marketing the images, which actually is Tim's work really. He sends out little packages of shots and the basic storyline, and editors occasionally get back to him. And that led to an article in Country Living magazine. And finally, after much campaigning, in BBC Wildlife magazine. And recently in France, an article's come out in Saint-Mentales magazine, best I can do on the pronunciation, and a better known magazine in Terre Sauvage, which is probably France's top wildlife environmental magazine. They ran a 4-page story on the cranes. That was actually on the back of winning second place in a photojournalism competition that the magazine helped to run, and they gave you a nice whopping cash prize, which is very welcome. So for me, the crane photography has really been win-win all round. I've absolutely loved doing the work, and the images have helped the people I've worked with to publicise the project, and have actually started to make some real income from the shots. I'm still taking crane photos and hope to keep doing so as they start to breed, which I hope will be in a few months' time. And encouraged by the crane experience, I've since collaborated with and provided free shots for some other conservation projects, which I'll mention very briefly. I've covered a couple of BioBlitz events in the Bristol area where specialists go out to record how many species there are and get families to come and join them and show the public what's living close to them. Kids get involved and whatever. And I love photographing people around nature. And I know that the shots I took have been used on various websites and leaflets, and just recently in a management plan for one of the sites that the BioBlitz has held. And some of the shots, they just started popping up in magazines. There's usually about a 2-year gap between taking a picture and any chance of it actually finding a way being paid for. I've also recently covered a team surveying hazel dormice near Bristol. Tip to any budding photographers: pick a photogenic subject. People like the pictures much more. And again, shots of dormice have been used by the trust behind the survey in their newsletter and AGM. And again, one image is about to be published in Terre Sauvage magazine, and I hope that others pop up elsewhere fairly soon. And finally, this year I've covered a project in Wiltshire that's improving farmland for nature. I've been getting shots to show the conservation margins around crops, really help encourage bumblebees and lots of other wildlife. And I showed some of the active work like renovating old dew ponds in the Marlborough Downs, and the wildlife that first moves into these new ponds. Again, the project's Facebook page and website have used a lot of my shots for free, but that worked out because I ended up being commissioned by one of the landowners who loved my shots. He said, "Wow, can I hire this guy to work on my estate?" And I said, "Yes," very quickly. So I got to photograph wildlife, farming and estate activities, racehorse training and horse trials, great fun to photograph. So my link with that project actually led to me getting paid fairly quickly. And just to close, as my collaborative approach has worked well so far for me, I'm keener than ever to hear about other conservation projects which my photos could help support, and crucially which could yield good wildlife shots, landscape shots, whatever, but stories that I might end up selling to magazines or generate interest that will pay back in the long term. Of course, if a project has a budget to actually cover some of my time, and I know that's rare, I'd be even more interested to get involved, and that way I'd be more likely to cover exactly what the project needs to tell their story. So I hope my presentation has shown that when conservation bodies link up with photographers, they can be more sure of getting strong imagery, which they can then use to document the project clearly and get the stories they want told out there through various media. And as the next speaker will explain, you can get people in your own organisation to do it. If you've got somebody who's really good with the camera, maybe, but if it needs specialist lenses, equipment, experience, then you might need a pro. Anyway, thanks for listening.
Thanks very much, Nick. I'm going to hand you over now to Roger Ingle. Roger is the Communications Officer for Fauna and Flora International. He oversees the design, photo selection and production of FFI's print materials and online presence. He was heavily involved in their branding overhaul in 2010. So he's going to offer us some practical insights about using photography in communications.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, so just to kind of follow on from what's already been said, I just want to give you some practical tips of how to source some images to use, get your hands on them, so that you can illustrate your stories with imagery, which is a much more powerful way than a story on its own. So the easiest, most basic, free way, well not always free, you might have to buy the equipment, is to take your own images. The advent of digital cameras, smartphones, etc., it's easier than ever to get your staff, get your partners to go out there and take some photos for you. So, for example, you can get people out in the field to take photos, in this case in Kurdistan, illustrating why it's sometimes still easier to travel by horse than by Range Rover. And really inaccessible places if you're kind of short on budget, but you just need a kind of a quick, fast solution. Just get your staff to take a photo. And photos from events as well. If you just want to only use them, for example, on your website, you don't necessarily always need them to be high resolution. So this is photo I took actually last week of David Attenborough and Consortium. The problem with staff taking photos is that you will have to sift through quite a lot to get to the good ones. If I ever see another photo of a workshop, I might just jump out a window. So you will have to there's a lot of quantity but not so much quality when you're getting your staff to take photos. Although you will occasionally get some great photos of this northern white rhino in Kenya. But I think with staff it's easier in some cases, but you're not always going to get great results. So if you've got a limited budget, it's great. If you can get in contact with a professional photographer and get them to take some photos for you, you can often get better results. And it's not as expensive as it may seem to commission a photographer, as Nick's alluded to, but they'll often do it for free or for because they want the promotion and the kind of extra revenue that will come.
And the access and the cooperation is a key thing usually.
So these photos were taken about 15 years ago of mountain gorillas in Central Africa, and we're still using them today. And I think to emphasise that sending a professional with the equipment, as Nick's alluded to, and the knowledge of how to take a great story and how to report on a great story is something you're not necessarily going to get with your staff. You might get some lucky shots like that rhino shot, but if you want to get some really great shots that are exclusively your own, if you can commission a photographer, then I think you're on to a winner. And in some cases, if you can't afford to send out somebody, you can always buy photos as well, which again is not as expensive as it may seem. Lots of photo libraries, such as Nature Picture Library, do discounts for non-profits and for charity. High resolution images, the great shots you get are brilliant for using on magazines that we produce, the kind of really high-end stuff, the really sharp, great quality images. We'd never, for example, use a star photo on the front cover of a magazine. So this is the kind of showing the design work behind the scenes, and that's the sneak preview of our next magazine there, which I very thankful for. I think you can have as many staff going out and take photos as you like, but there was always going to be a few gaps that you need to find an image for. So I couldn't really get a time machine and go back and take a photo of David Attenborough for this particular use. There are ways to kind of circumnavigate that a bit to find some free images. One great example that I found over the years is to use Flickr to find the numerous great quality amateur photographers on there. And the quality can be great, and often these might be people that have got some good equipment and know how to tell a story, and you can pick out some great ones. It's worth just going on there, searching for some. This is an example of Wendy. We've actually used quite a few of her images in the past. And you can forge some really good relationships with these photographers and end up using them again and again, which is great. And they often love the exposure that comes with it as well. They're quite flattered to begin with, and so you really want to use my photos, but you can get some great images that way. And also via crystal-based archive, particularly for endangered species. It's a great tool for finding images and connecting with photographers who who then you may go on to use one of their images to begin with, and then commission them to do some work for you. And that's often, in these cases anyway, these photos are so hard to get. The professional photographers have to spend a lot of time and a lot of patience, a lot of skill goes into getting these images, but not necessarily going to charge the charities a lot to use them because the exposure that comes with it. And I know that Archive have just recently introduced this green flag method where you can where images are tagged up so that they're free to use for non-profits, educational use. So it's worth going on there to check out and find images as well. And similarly with Flickr, the Creative Commons licenses where you can go on and use images, but I'd always recommend just to contact the photographer in the first place anyway and forge that personal relationship. So what works? It all depends on your audiences. Again, kind of alluding to what Nick said already, photogenic stuff definitely works, and in this case this was an appeal that went out recently for the snow leopard that's raised quite a bit of money for us. And this is quite an interesting combination of two types of image. So we've got the image on the right taken by a professional of a snow leopard cub. Actually in captivity, I don't think you'd ever get that close to one in the wild. But in the wild on the left are a series of camera trap images of a couple of snow leopards, naughty snow leopards that actually took an interest in one of our camera traps and approached it, took it around a bit. I think actually one of them got stolen and was never recovered. So this was quite an interesting dichotomy between the realism of the field and the kind of the higher end storytelling, like great quality photo. But I think just to emphasise that the camera trap stuff there is pure luck. I think that they're really lucky to get images like that. Whereas sending out a pro, they're going to know how to tell a story. They're going to have the patience to document. So where can you use these images? They range all the way from social media and website and newsletters. And I think in those cases you can get away with photos taken by your staff, the slightly lower res, the kind of the not great quality because it's telling the story in other ways. But for magazines and posters, and I missed off there, but for sending out press releases, especially that's been mentioned, they often will come back and say, can we have some great photos? And if they've got some great photos, usually taken by a professional, then you're more likely to see that story go further. And just a last kind of point I want to kind of implore you, please, as you start to build your own libraries, organise them. I wish somebody had done that before me. We've got about 7,000 photos documented now and organised, catalogued. But that's the tip of the iceberg, and we've got ones on the slides taken years and years ago. But I think it's really important to keep a record of where your photos came from, so that you can, as we mentioned, credit them to the photographer and just keep an idea, keep them where those photos came from, if there's any kind of licenses you need to go with them as well.
Lovely, thanks very much, Roger. Does anybody have any questions?
For the purposes of campaigning around conservation and environmental issues, sort of what kind of content needs to be there? So we've seen a lot of really beautiful images, but what I'm kind of lacking a bit is more specific guidance about really what to put in terms of ingredients.
In terms of text or
Well, imagery, I guess, given the sort of images in the photograph.
So you were talking about photo features that you could get published in magazines and newspapers.
Yeah, so
Just
sorry.
about the work that you do.
Yeah, the context of the work freelance I do for campaign work with organisations like WWF, and so some of the tools or products that come into play in those campaigns sometimes can be, what about if we do a photo story or photo essay? And it's kind of like a great idea, but then some of the material you get back from the field, if it's not commissioned from a really good professional photographer, can be quite lacking in terms of intimacy or human interest or action or whatever it has to be. So I just wanted to hear your views on what those ingredients need to be to really make
a strong start. Well, lots of different things. I would say, I mean, obviously, technically very good, very strong composition, unusual angles, a variety of photographs. So if one were commissioning a photographer, I mean, a photographer with a good journalistic way of thinking would know to take photographs from the long view, the big picture, to a small still life of a given story. So I think variety is hugely important. Different times of day, different light, comprising the sort of more interpretive photograph, if you like, to something that's more literal. So I think variety is really important. Composition, technical strength.
As Nick was saying, part of my job at Nature is to take the work of photographers, to take photo stories and to sell them as photo features to books and magazines and newspapers. Now, in my experience, the first thing you need to get an editor's attention is the images have to be different and they have to be strong. So sometimes, especially with newspapers, it might be that there's a quirky element, or it might be something, at an angle that you haven't seen before. I recently sold a photo story about fishing bears, but they were taken from an underwater perspective rather than above the water. And crucially, after you've got somebody's attention, you need to then weave a narrative around those photographs. There has to be a story. It has to be a compelling story to tell, because that's what then piques their interest. They think, oh, our readers might be interested in hearing about this. And there's different levels of that, depends what publication you want to go for. So for something like the Daily Mail, you're looking for something very anthropomorphic. You saw those pictures I put up earlier of polar bears that look like they're dancing. Perfect. It gets the story out there, it's quirky, it's comical. But then for something, a scientific journal, or for a magazine like BBC Wildlife, you're going to need something that's more intelligent and has more interesting content. Does that answer the question?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think from my point of view, a lot of the time I leave it to people like Tim to get the stories out there. They have more contacts than I do. But if I happen to know the editor of a magazine or people who work there, I will quite often just email straight to the director or the features editor or whatever and say, look at these pictures I've just taken of the crane project. They're starting to get out there, they're starting to court, they're starting to dance. And they may, they did eventually come back through Nature Picture Library and took an article. But I've also pitched things sort of locally to sort of county magazines, and whatever I'm pitching, it has to be the local, like in Wiltshire, it has to be, bugs in Wiltshire, and kind of make a feature of that, or birds on a local lake that's very, very famous there. And actually, I've never happened before or since, but I sold 2 stories in one afternoon just by sending 2 little packages of about 10 photos and about 6 lines of story. Editor phoned me up straight away and said, yeah, I'll have both of those. So we have a good relationship. I've been trying to sell the crane story to a German magazine on the back of the German link, because the eggs come from Germany, and there's a very charismatic German scientist involved. And they're hovering. They're kind of. The biggest tip I can give you is if you want to sell a story to a magazine, make sure it's a fluffy animal as the lead animal, because they lap those up. Birds and bugs are harder, but it's not impossible.
It can be quite unpredictable at times as well. There's certainly an element of timing to a season when the story is more likely to work, and sometimes a year, obviously. But it can be very difficult to second guess editors. You get all sorts of responses coming in from stories that they might send down. So sometimes
what
they'll.
you're saying about making sure that you tailor it to the right.
Absolutely. You need to think about the audience.
To the right magazine.
One thing we as scientists often do is produce imagery of our own that isn't photographed as a computer-generated imagery. Do the same guidelines, so not necessarily
the same rules. If you're
photographs.
trying to get attention from the image, it needs to be, really an attention-grabbing image. There's a photography competition in the States. It's called Scientific Imagery, and I nearly entered it once, but the entry process was so long I got bored and I lost it. Anyway, but that's very much the kind of thing. There are people who are using kind of electron microscopy and sort of beautifully coloured graphic art to recreate things, all kinds of really clever computer-generated images to get interest in their science and their projects. I think it's run by the Institute of Science or something. If you email me, I can dig it out. But that's a specific example of great imagery about very detailed science, drawing attention to projects. And it's the kind of thing, a magazine editor is going to glaze over, about certain very detailed technical subjects, but they see a great image, they'll say, that's worth putting in my magazine.
So, absolutely, visually arresting, that's the key. The inroad is always how visually arresting is the picture.
Look at the cover of New Scientist, and I still take that. I'm a university scientist originally, but they always have very imaginative artwork on the front. Could be a photo, could be a computer-generated image. It's often graphical, but they're often tackling really mind-bogglingly complex subjects. But it's the image is like, I want to know more about that immediately. So same rule.
I was just going to say, coming from a graphic design background, I should say this as well, but often if you could find an illustrator or a graphic designer who can kind of translate that original image into something we're keeping its integrity and then translating it to something that has the visual kind of element to it as well, and will get noticed. So that's worth considering as well. Like we've done that with infographics and with data maps and things, and just it might kind of, it looks fine in a journal, but as soon as you try and put it to a magazine or something, it sticks. And so working with illustrators and graphic designers just kind of smooth that over and make it visually more appealing would be a good way to do it.
Yes. So an issue that we have is our organisation works specifically with plants and to increase awareness of plant science. Photos of plants tend to come out looking very pretty. You get a lot of pictures of nice flowers, and that's not really what we're about. Have you got any tips or ideas for conveying plant science or plant conservation through photos that doesn't come out looking like some kind of Christmas calendar?
Depends what kind of story do you want to tell.
What message are you
Yeah,
trying to get
what's the
across?
story you want to tell with the image?
The importance of plant science for the 21st century.
Well, we must talk later because maybe I can help. But I think sometimes there are traditions in photography, they get a bit too ingrained. I mentioned earlier I do a lot of macro photography of insects, invertebrates of all kinds, and plants. But actually a lot of what I do isn't pure macro. Macro is a one-to-one magnification scale. I mostly use a wide-angle lens that focuses very closely because I'm an ecologist by training, so I always want to show the insect or the seashore island, all the plants, whatever, in its setting. So I use a wide-angle lens to show the plant, often pretty, bold in the foreground, but I'll show the background, whether it be mountain landscape or an approaching tract or whatever. So you can kind of tell a story much more within an image like that. I took some shots. I've got quite a portfolio of shots of invasive plants, so like a great mat of three-cornered leek on a Cornish headland to kind of show nothing else grows here now because this alien is here. I took some shots of Spartina grass sort of stabilising the edge of the salt marsh on the Severn estuary with a Severn crossing in the background. For me, that's kind of, it's storytelling in a shot. As a filmmaker, I would usually try and get a close-up and a wide to stitch a shot together. But increasingly in filmmaking, I wanted to use that wide-angle perspective to kind of tell it in one. I'm doing the same for photography. So that's a technique I think that we use to put it in context. But yeah, so is the context important? But yes, if you want to give the feel of a plant being a menacing invader, shoot it backlit or shadowy or something to convey the mood. Not always pretty. But yeah, the tradition is close-up, glowing, beautiful plant. You're right.
Also thinking about the meaning of the photograph to your audience, so try to relate it to that person's personal experience. What plants do they have in their garden? How important is that to them? If they plant these species, they're going to get the insects. If they get the insects, they get the birds. So it's kind of relating it to them personally, not just saying plants are important for for the environment, for the planet, what have you, but actually relating it to the individual.
I was just going to say, adding people to that image can actually really help, similar to tractors or something in the background. Sometimes to give it a sense of scale or to give it a sense of idea of who's using these plants or why they're valuable. So you can kind of help place whether those plants or that the flora can be found. So my tip would be to get some photos of people.
Yes.
Just on the plants thing, there's a super guy called Rob Kessler who does micrographs of things like pollen grains and that kind of stuff. So it's a slightly different angle to the one to the really good suggestions, but kind of just amazing. And then he false colours them and stuff. So that's another way of tackling it.
And there are some new techniques coming. There's a technique called focus stacking, where you take an image and you advance the focus and take another one, and you take a series of shots and you combine them. And you get kind of sort of surreal depth of focus. And I've seen a few, similar to the microscope idea. It's an amazing shot of a nettle stem, and you suddenly get, wow, this thing looks really scary. Because normally you just get one thing in focus, but you get the whole thing. So there are different ways to visualize technically, but it's all about storytelling. Good images tell stories.
Okay, I think unless there's any more burning questions, I might just do a quick summary. Does anybody else wanting to say anything? No? Okay, so we've got a couple of minutes just to summarise then, if I can decide for my scribbles, that is. So we've heard that there are many opportunities for using imagery in your communication, social media, websites, all kinds of print materials. I think one of the key messages is that we should be seeing content moments everywhere. So you need to have strong visuals in your corner and strong narratives. Now, one way of doing that is to forge connections with photographers. As we've seen from Nick, they may be willing to work for free, but there needs to be some kind of mutual benefit. So crediting photographers prominently is key. As it acknowledges their contribution, it gives them exposure, and it opens doors for future collaborations. Roger mentioned that you might take your own images for things like social media, images from members of staff perhaps, or from events, but the quality is unlikely to be enough for printed materials. And what you'll be lacking by not using a professional like Nick is the storytelling ability of photographers. Photographers like Nick who will wait for days to photograph a group of cranes flying over the Pyrenees, your staff are unlikely to have that.
Weeks, actually.
Weeks. I was afraid it might have been that. And that's definitely something worth paying for, because the correct use of photography will benefit you in the long run. So thinking about photography right from the beginning, not as an afterthought. How can photography help your campaign? What kind of photography will you need? Where can you get it from? Do you need a budget? All of these sorts of considerations. Joanna talked about the confluence of words and images and using quote pictures. So you've got this marriage of words and pictures that resonate together, a combination of aesthetics and information. So this is an example of the 2020 Vision Project Communications, and Nick mentioned that earlier. It's all about reconnecting people to the natural environment and how we can restore our habitats in the UK. So this postcard is basically communicating ecosystem services, but in a way that doesn't feel overly scientific or takes too long to get the message across.
And the book's wonderful if you want to buy it online.
It is. It is. Joanna talked about the importance of stories, which of course is the theme of the conference and something that we keep going on and on about here. These might be good news stories, good beautiful images that trigger empathy, or it might be something more shocking, more visceral, like the Consuming Nature project. Both approaches have value and can lead to successful, attention-grabbing campaigns. 10,000 likes on Facebook is no mean feat, especially if it's driving people to a website, and extended narratives. Stories, crucially, make people care. Images connect them to the subject that you want to talk about. And like for example with the cranes, how can you care about a bird that's been absent from the UK for 400 years if you don't even know what it looks like? And many people don't. So the image is doing a crucial job there. By telling the story of an individual, you can also introduce a larger concept. So here we've got one polar bear that has died from starvation. This is an image which was used in August in the national press and online, and it went viral. Now, the story of this unfortunate bear is the story of climate change. So it's not just about the animal that's affected, it's about the larger issue. And we heard earlier from Harvest the mantra, provoke, relate, reveal. So here you've got provocation, isn't this awful, isn't this sad? Relating it to the fact that this bear died because of shrinking ice due to climate change. And then finally the payoff, the reveal, is it isn't just this bear that's a threat, it's all polar bears, it's the planet, it's us. And I think I'll end here on this quote from George Schaller, who said, photographers have done more for conservation than scientists and writers combined. It's a slightly controversial comment, but definitely something that we should all be thinking about. as Nick was saying, part of my job at Nature is to take the work of photographers, to take photo stories and to sell them as photo features to books and magazines and newspapers. Now, in my experience, the first thing you need to get an editor's attention is the images have to be different and they have to be strong. So sometimes, especially with newspapers, it might be that there's a quirky element, or it might be something, at an angle you haven't seen before. I recently sold a photo story about fishing bears, but they were taken from an underwater perspective rather than above the water. And crucially, after you've got somebody's attention, you need to then weave a narrative around those photographs. It has to be a story. It has to be a compelling story to tell, because that's what then piques their interest. They think, oh, our readers might be interested in hearing about this. And there's different levels of that. Depends what publication you want to go for. So for something like the Daily Mail, you're looking for something very anthropomorphic. You saw those pictures I put up earlier of polar bears that look like they're dancing. Perfect. It gets the story out there. It's quirky, it's comical. But then for something, a scientific journal, or for a magazine like BBC Wildlife, you're going to need something that's more intelligent and has more interesting content. Does that answer the question?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think from my point of view, a lot of the time I leave it to people like Tim to get the stories out. They have more contacts than I do. But if I happen to know the editor of a magazine or people who work there, I will quite often just email straight to the director or the features editor or whatever and say, look at these pictures I've just taken of the crane project. They're starting to get out there, they're starting to court, they're starting to dance. And they may, they did eventually come back through Nature Picture Library and took an article. But I've also pitched things sort of locally to sort of county magazines, and whatever I'm pitching has to be the local. I come from Wiltshire, it has to be bugs in Wiltshire, and kind of make a feature of that, or birds on a local lake that's very very famous there. And actually, I've never happened before or since, but I sold 2 stories in one afternoon just by sending 2 little packages of about 10 photos and about 6 lines of story. Editor phoned me up straight away and said, yeah, I'll have both of those. So we have a good relationship. I've been trying to sell the crane story to a German magazine on the back of the German link, because the eggs come from Germany, and there's a very charismatic German scientist involved. And they're hovering. They're kind of. The biggest tip I can give you is, if you want to sell a story to a magazine, make sure it's a fluffy animal as the lead animal, because they lap those up. Birds and bugs are harder, but it's not impossible.
It can be quite unpredictable at times as well. There's certainly an element of timing to a season when the story is more likely to work, and sometimes a year, obviously. But it can be very difficult to second guess editors. You get all sorts of responses coming in from stories that they might send down. So sometimes
what
they'll.
you're saying about making sure that you tailor it to the right.
Absolutely.
Tailor your
Yeah,
angle
you need to think about the audience.
to the right magazine.
One thing we as scientists often do is produce imagery of our own that isn't photographed as a computer generated imagery.